Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good to see you all today. We are going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 this morning, so if you have a Bible with you, I'd encourage you to turn there. I'm going to read out of the New International Version, but you're welcome to follow, of course, whatever version or variety you might have. We're going to focus on verses 1 through 15 this morning. It's kind of a long chapter. It says this: "And now, brothers and sisters, we want you to know about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. In the midst of a very severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their abilities. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. And they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then, by the will of God, also to us. So we urge Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace I've given you. I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. And here is my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. Last year you were the first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work, so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it according to your needs. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what we need. The goal is equality, as it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little." May the Lord bless the reading of his word this morning. Would you bow with me in prayer? Lord God, I'm thankful that we have the opportunity to examine your word together this morning, to see what truths and messages you have for us in it. God, I pray that you would speak to each of us through the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians this morning. That you'd help us to learn something new, and that when we leave this morning, that new knowledge would work itself out into action in our lives, making us want to live differently than we lived before, more like you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. When I first looked at this chapter a couple weeks ago and started to prepare for this morning, I did sort of my first read through and said, oh, chapter's about generosity. It's a pretty easy subject. That's not anything hard or difficult or controversial. And then I started to read it more, and the little conviction started up in my heart. Because generosity is an easy thing to talk about. It's a lot harder to live it out, at least in the way that Paul describes here in this chapter. And so I'd like to start by giving you just a little bit of context. Paul here is encouraging the Corinthians to give with generosity. He's referring to an offering that is apparently being taken up for the Christians in Judea, in Israel, around the area of Jerusalem. Likely those Christians in that area needed support because they were facing pretty intense persecution at that time. Persecution at the hands of the Jews and the Pharisees. And so they likely needed some support from their brothers and sisters who were not facing similar persecution. So Paul went to the churches that he had started and the churches he had influence over in his journeys around the Mediterranean and urged them to give with generosity in support of their brothers and sisters who were in need. Here he urges the Corinthians to do that exact thing. And he also holds up as an example to them another church or a series of churches in Macedonia that had already given and had done so in the way that Paul thought was appropriate and befitting the way Christians should give. And so if we look back at what he says about the Macedonians Christians example, I think there's three important things that we can take out of their example that apply to all generosity, not just generosity in the ancient world at Paul's time. The first thing I noticed when we look at the Macedonian Christian example is that Paul says they gave despite their own deep poverty. That they themselves weren't exactly like riding high on the hog. They were not wealthy individuals. And yet, even through that poverty, they had a desire and they felt an urgency to give. It's pretty easy for us to give when we have extra. When we have surplus and abundance, it's pretty easy to whip out the wallet and to throw a few dollars in the offering plate or to write a check. When we have plenty and when giving doesn't force us to tighten up our belts, it's kind of a piece of cake. Generosity becomes simple, it seems. This represents, I think, cheap giving, because it doesn't cost us a whole lot. It requires little sacrifice. It doesn't require us to give up anything significant. It made me think of a portion of the Gospel of Luke. It's often called the widow's coins, or the widow's mite. Find it in Luke chapter 21, verses 1 through 4, and I'll read those for you real quickly. It says, "And he being Jesus, looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small coins. And he said, Truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. For they all out of their surplus put into the offering. But she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on." Jesus here presents the gift of the widow, the 2 small coins she had to drop into the collection box, as more significant, more powerful than the much larger gifts that the wealthy people gave. Why is that? It seems to be that the wealthy gave out of their abundance, out of their extra, out of their surplus. The widow gave out of her poverty. The wealthy gave what they had left over. The widow gave all that she had to live on. So for Jesus, it seems that he defines generosity not by the number in the amount box on the checks that we write, but of the spirit of self-sacrifice that our giving requires, about how much we're willing to give up of not just what we have left over, but of what we need for ourselves. I think we would all acknowledge that gifts are a lot more meaningful and a lot more precious when they require the giver to sacrifice something of value in order to give the gift. Being an English teacher, it made me think of a famous short story called The Gift of the Magi by a writer named O. Henry. Probably a story a lot of you are familiar with, but I'll kind of give you the quick 10-second version of the plot here. The story focuses on a young couple who is deeply in love but also deeply in poverty with the holidays approaching. And each one desires to give the other a gift that would be an adequate expression of the love they felt for each other. Each of them also had one prized possession. The young man had a watch that had been passed down, I believe, in his family for generations. The woman valued her long, beautiful hair. And so in their desire to purchase something of value from the other person, the man ends up selling his most prized possession, his watch, in order to obtain money to buy a set of combs for his wife's hair, a fancy, beautiful set of combs. The wife, on the other hand, goes to a wig maker and sells her hair to buy her husband a gold chain to carry his watch on. And so in the end, they exchange the gifts, and the irony is they realize that in giving each other gifts that they thought the other would appreciate, they sacrificed the objects that they needed to appreciate those gifts. And the gifts became useless. Sort of. Not really, though, I think. Because despite the irony, the couple is left with evidence of the depth of their love for one another. The depth of their love is evident in the fact that they were each willing to sacrifice what was most precious to them in order to give something to the one that they loved. These gifts might not have represented huge dollar amounts, but they were obtained at great personal cost, which made them very precious. I think the same principle is true of our giving. Whether it's giving to the church or giving to individuals in our lives, whether it's a monetary gift or a gift of a different variety, the true generosity is not measured by the monetary value of what we give, or what we give, our willingness to give out of our abundance, but our willingness to sacrifice of ourselves to show value. The second thing the Macedonian Christians' example can tell us is that Paul emphasizes they gave of their own accord. They didn't give out of obligation. They didn't give because they were coerced. I think a gift given out of obligation probably has little meaning or little value. Maybe think of like a boss who, in the time leading up to boss's celebration day, I don't know if that's what maybe it is. In the time leading up to this holiday honoring your boss, he makes it clear to his employees that he expects lavish gifts from them. And he maybe hints at the fact that if they don't give him the gifts that he expects, they might not be working for him very much longer. If we look at somebody who gave a gift under that circumstance, we probably wouldn't think of them as overly generous. Their generosity wouldn't impress us because we recognize they didn't give because they wanted to give. They gave because they kind of had to. They felt obligation to give. Giving out of my own accord is an area of struggle, and has been an area of struggle for me, because I'll be honest with you, I'm naturally kind of a cheapskate. Probably part of the way that I was growing up, my family was a family of penny pinchers, and I think that they wouldn't mind me saying that. And so I grew up with that mentality. And so one of the ways that manifested itself in my life is that earlier in my young adult life, I was a pretty mediocre tipper. I'd go to restaurants and I would leave pretty meager tips. And I'm not here to give you a lesson this morning in the etiquette of tipping, but I will say that early on in my marriage to my wife, she's not here this morning so I can talk about her. Early on in my marriage to my wife, I noticed, sometimes she'd glance over and would give me kind of a disdainful look at the fact that I was tipping in a pretty mediocre fashion. And in my defense, we were young. I was just out of college, and the places that I went to eat in college often didn't require me to give tips. Spent a lot of time at Little Caesars, and I don't think they accept tips there. So I didn't really have experience in the art of tip giving. And initially, I started to tip higher when she was around, but not because I was being generous. It was because I felt like I had to. I felt like I was kind of being shamed into giving better tips. And so it wasn't really generosity because it was forced and not genuine. I will report that over time, my wife has helped me overcome my cheapskate tendencies and become a more naturally generous giver, at least in that area. And so, the good news is you can change, I guess. When we give out of obligation and not out of a genuine desire to bless other people, the act loses a lot of its meaning and value, I think. The recipient of that sort of false generosity oftentimes can sense the giver is reluctant, that he's not giving freely, but giving out of obligation, and it ruins the meaning of it for them. God also, who sees our hearts more than he sees our outward actions, I think is not pleased or glorified by giving that's tight-fisted and not genuine. I also think that giving reluctantly can cause me, the giver, to miss out on blessings that we can receive from God through our own generosity. And so we have to recognize the Macedonians demonstrate this for us, that generosity can't be forced or obligated. It has to be given of our own free will and out of a desire to both serve others and to glorify God. Last thing I think we can get out of the Macedonians example is what Paul says in verse 5. Let me reread that to you. It says, and they exceeded our expectations. They gave themselves first of all to the Lord, and then by the will of God also to us. The reason why the Macedonians were able to give despite their poverty, the reason why they were able to give of their own accord instead of being kind of guilted into it, is because they first gave themselves entirely over to God's lordship. They saw their money no longer as a possession they had, but as something that belonged to God, because the entirety of who they were belonged to God. They didn't see giving to the saints in Jerusalem as an act of charity, but as an act of worship, a way they could show honor to God, surrendering over to the kingship of God Almighty. When they gave themselves up to God, they not only gave up control of their resources, but they also trusted in God to provide for their needs. This is sometimes a struggle for me, because at times I feel like if I give, my family and I might suffer lack in some of our basic needs. And so I'm reluctant at times to give, because I feel like if I give, I won't be able to make ends meet at the end of the month. What this really reveals, if I'm honest about it, is a lack of faith. A sign that I'm still working to submit myself fully to God's lordship and trust that he'll provide for me when I do so. If we fully acknowledge God as our King and trust him to direct our life, we must also believe that if we give the way he wants us to give, that he'll provide for us, no matter what. And when I trust him to completely provide for my needs, I'm able to give freely even out of my poverty. And so when we look back at that example of the Christians in Macedonia, we can see those three really critical principles of generosity here. They gave out of their poverty, not out of their extra. They gave freely and willingly. They gave as an act of devotion to God above all, as a way to worship. The next thing Paul talks about is he tackles the question, why? Why should we give with generosity? What does it matter? And he gives us a couple of different reasons. The first one is what I think is the most important. He goes on to talk about the fact that generosity and the self-sacrifice that generosity requires are fundamental attributes of who God is. We see this most strongly in verse 9. Verse 9 says, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through you his poverty might become rich." The greatest example of generosity this world has ever seen is Christ giving up the riches of his glory in heaven and making himself low, exchanging his greatness and his glory for earthly poverty. Why did he do this? Verse 9 says that we could become rich, that we could trade our poverty for the riches of holiness, for the riches of salvation. It's worth noticing here that when Paul talks about richness and poorness, he's not talking about terms that refer to money or wealth. Jesus' generosity wasn't the act of transferring dollars into our bank account. He expressed his generosity by giving himself up completely, giving the whole of himself up for our benefit, sacrificing his life, sacrificing his holiness, so that we could be saved. Jesus' example of generosity reflects, I think, all the same principles that the Macedonians' generosity also did. When Jesus gave himself to us, he didn't give out of his extra. He gave up his very life. He gave up everything that he was. He didn't give out of obligation or because he had to. He gave himself up willingly. And when he did so, he did it out of obedience to his Father, out of complete submission to the will of God. So the question is, why should our lives be characterized by generosity? Because Christ showed us the ultimate generosity. And as imitators of him, we should strive to do the same. Second major reason Paul gives for why we should be generous has to do with equality. And for that, I'm going to look back at verses 13 through 15. Those say, "Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little." Paul seems to want the Corinthians to know that he's not trying to make the Judeans wealthy at everyone else's expense. He's not setting up these particular people as more important, and so trying to channel all the wealth in his area of influence to the Judeans at the expense of everyone else. They weren't more important. He tells them that when you have plenty, when you have the ability to give to those in need, you should do it. And when the roles are reversed, when you are in need, you find that generosity flows back in the direction that is appropriate. The principle is that when we practice generosity, that generosity tends to be repaid in times of our need. I know that I've seen that at work in my life. I'm willing to bet that most of you, all of you, have seen that as well. There have been times where members of this congregation have showed great generosity to myself or to my family. And so, when the roles are reversed, when we have the ability, it's important to us to try to be generous because we have experience on the other end. Because we know what it's like to receive generosity, what a blessing. Part of considering the needs of others before ourselves and to give generously to others because of their needs is trusting our fellow Christians to do the same for us. It reminds me a little bit of a marriage relationship. In a marriage relationship, each partner has to fully give themselves over, to give 100% of themselves, and trust that their partner will return 100% of themselves. It can't be this thing where we give only a portion of ourselves and keep some for ourselves, but where we give freely and trust that it will be returned to us, be reciprocated to us. The tricky part, I think, is this. When we give, getting something in return shouldn't be the main motivator of our generosity. It's a byproduct, it's a fringe benefit maybe, but if we're only giving in order for a blessing to be returned to us, that isn't really generosity. It's an investment. It's not selfless, it becomes an act of selfishness, masking itself as generosity. Receiving generosity in return should be a byproduct of the giving that we do. Additional encouragement maybe, but not the main goal. Jesus tells us time and time again, I think most strongly in the Sermon on the Mount, that we should give expecting nothing in return. This is part of what allows us to give through and despite our need and our poverty. If we can trust others to return that to us, if we can trust others to be generous back to us in the same way that we show generosity, and if we truly trust God to provide for our needs, we're more likely to be generous regardless of our circumstances. So the last question I'd like to tackle today is a practical one. How? If we recognize the need for generosity, if we recognize what true generosity looks like, how do we carry that out in our lives, here and now, amongst each other, amongst the community we live in? A couple of things stood out to me. Firstly, I think that we cannot discriminate in who we show generosity to. Let me explain what I mean by that. It's really natural. It's a natural human tendency to want to focus on the people closest to us, the people whom we like the most, the people to whom it's easy to be generous to. It's certainly easier to live that out. It doesn't require as much stretching on our part. But I wonder, is that how Jesus practiced his generosity? We look to him as our example. And the answer is certainly not. If we look at Jesus' displays of generosity in the Bible and the Gospels, we see that he didn't limit them to his friends, his family, or his followers. I think of the story when he fed 5,000 people. It wasn't as though he kept his inner circle close by and sent everyone else away and said, fend for yourself, other people, I'm going to feed those closest to me. That was the disciples' plan. They said, well, they can feed it outright. Jesus said, no, we're going to feed everyone. Everyone deserves my help, my generosity, my gift. He blessed them all. More broadly, the most generous gift, the gift of his death on the cross, the gift of the mercy that he offers us, the salvation, wasn't just for his buddies. Wasn't just for his disciples. Christ died for all, including his enemies. Because of that, we can't just choose to be generous towards other Christians. We can't just choose to be generous to the people who we're closest to or who are the easiest to show generosity to. And I don't think that anybody tells themselves that. Nobody verbalizes inside their head or out loud, I'm just going to be nice to the people who are nice to me. But I think there's a conscious attitude, or a conscious or an unconscious attitude, and I've seen it in myself, to prioritize the people who we like, to give them the priority. After all, they're more deserving, right? They're the closest, they're the nicest, maybe. They're less likely to take advantage of a gift freely given. Doesn't Romans say in the book of Romans that Christ died for those who were righteous enough to deserve it? Oh, that's not all what it says, I don't think. What does it say? It says that Christ died for the ungodly. Christ died for us when we were his enemies. Christ died for us when we least deserved a generous gift. We were and we are grossly undeserving of the generosity that Jesus gave to us. Christ showed us love and generosity when we were his enemies, when we were opposed to him. Can we then limit our generosity to other Christians only, or to other deserving individuals at the expense of the people who really need it? I don't think so. That's a hard truth to reckon with, but I think it's a necessary one. The generosity that we give, the giving that we display, can't be dependent on other people's ability to earn it or their ability to deserve it. I think it should reflect the grace and mercy that Christ freely gave us. As a matter of fact, Jesus was unconcerned with even whether the generosity was appreciated. He didn't even seem to care if it was taken advantage of. I think of, again, Sermon on the Mount, when he says, if someone forces you to go with him 1 mile, go with him 2. If someone takes your cloak, give him your tunic as well. There's no appreciation of generosity there. But he says, do it anyways. This doesn't mean that we don't show discernment in how we display our generosity. We might still be wise and discerning in the ways that we express generosity to others. For example, if I knew someone had a drug problem or suspected they might have a drug problem, I probably wouldn't hand them a $20 bill and say, knock yourself out. But it doesn't mean that I wouldn't buy them a meal or that I couldn't put gas in the car. It doesn't mean I couldn't show some other way to be generous to them. So an important point for me is that since God doesn't discriminate in who he offers love to, we can't limit generosity to only the people who we like or the people we want to be generous with. The second major thing is that we have to recognize, I have to recognize, that we can be generous in ways that don't require money. And that's hard because we most often think of generosity and we think of dollar amounts. We think of giving money or giving resources that cost money. But ask yourself, what else can we be generous with in our lives? How else can we display generosity? I made a big old list. Just in the 2 minutes that I thought about it. We can be generous with time. We can be generous with resources other than money. I think of my next door neighbor, Red Kaufman and Elaine Kaufman, who anytime I need a tool of any kind, he's there with it. And he usually teaches me how to do it because I don't know how to do it myself. He's there with his resources. We can be generous with the attention that we give to others, kindness, with sympathy or empathy for others and the struggles they go through. We can be generous with praise and with compliments. We can be generous in the prayer that we offer for others. We can be generous in the use of our skills and talents. We can be generous in the offering of forgiveness. We can be generous in hugs and high fives. So much more that we can be generous with. I oftentimes catch myself thinking at some point in my life, when I attain financial stability, whatever that is, I'll be more generous. Because it won't cost me as much. That's the part I don't say to myself. Such an attitude like that fails to recognize that we should give in poverty, as we've already talked about, not just in extra. And that we can be generous in ways, I can be generous in ways that don't cost me anything, at least in terms of money. Lastly, I think we have to understand that tithing is one portion of how we show Christian generosity, but it isn't the fullness of how we should show generosity. I think tithing is an important and necessary practice, and I'll leave it to somebody else more learned than myself to go through the details of what tithing should look like. But I do know this. We can't simply write a check or drop a few dollars in the offering plate and then feel like we've fulfilled our call to live generously and to give liberally. It's got to go beyond that one moment in the pew on a Sunday morning. Generosity for us has to be a lifestyle, a daily calling, not a weekly or a monthly obligation that we buy off with a few dollars. I wonder if we all made generosity a daily calling in our lives, as an expression of our love for God, as an act of worship to God. How would our lives be different? How would our church be different? How would our community be different? How much more effective would our ministries be? And how much more would we be blessed in return with our willingness to show generosity? So in closing, I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask myself to do some self-reflection, to reevaluate. Reevaluate how you spend. How you spend money, first and foremost. How you budget your time. How you spend attention and energy on others. How often can you say, how often can I say, that my actions show evidence of generosity? How often does my life show the sort of selflessness that Jesus showed us and shows us continually? The kind of generosity he commands us to imitate. If you're anything like me, there's a long ways to go there. It might seem daunting, like an unreachable goal to be generous in the way that Christ was generous. But that doesn't mean we don't try every day to get a little bit closer to that. I'd encourage you to make a commitment today, inwardly, to God, between yourself and the Lord, to find ways to increase your generosity, even in small ways. For you, it might look like choosing to sponsor that compassion child whose photo was in the back a couple weeks ago, but you didn't commit to it at that point. Maybe it's making an hour to take a friend to lunch who needs to talk, who needs some attention, some love, some support. Maybe it's volunteering a week to help out with VBS, even if that's a way outside your comfort zone. It'll look different for each one of you. But I'd encourage you to ask God how he would have you show greater generosity in your life. It's one of the ways that we can reach fulfillment as individual Christians, and one of the ways that we can grow as a body, be more powerful in the ministries and the life that he wants us to lead. I'm going to ask that our worship team come up and close us with a song.